Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to session number 16 on modeling border carbon adjustments, GTAP-E. We have three presentations today. The first one will be given by Ralph from UNCTAD. He will be presenting on a paper titled "Understanding the Potential Impacts of Border Carbon Adjustment in the Global Economy." It will be followed by Anna Strutt from University of Waikato, who will be presenting on border carbon adjustment and potential impacts on the Asia-Pacific region. And the final presentation this session will be by Francesco Clora from University of Copenhagen, who will be presenting on alternative border carbon adjustment mechanism in the European Union and responses, aggregate and within coalition results. Let me just remind everyone on the session protocol before we start that all attendees must mute their mic unless you are authorized to speak by the session host or the chair. All presentations will last for 20 minutes, and we will have a 10-minute discussion that will follow after that, and a three-minute transition. So for now, I turn it over to Ralph, who will be presenting on carbon border adjustments in the global economy. Ralph?
Good morning, and thank you very much, Erwin. So I'm going to present a paper on understanding the potential impacts of carbon border adjustments on the global economy. And I hope you can see my screen.
Looks good, Ralph, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to thank the GTAP Center for working with us, with UNCTAD on this project. It's part of a broader project by UNCTAD on trade and climate change. And in particular, I would like to thank you, Erwin, and Maxime, whom I have also seen as a participant here. So I'm glad that you are here and you can help me out for any tricky questions. I think the objective here with carbon reduction is quite clear. So there are the Sustainable Development Goals, of course. Then there is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and its 21st meeting. The Paris Agreement, countries agreed to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius or hopefully below this. And it is clear that carbon or more in general greenhouse gas emissions have to be reduced. There are several unilateral measures that can be taken, including carbon pricing, or there could be strong regulations. So there are unilateral tools that are available here. Two major concerns by policymakers come up. The first one is the loss of international competitiveness if they increase unilaterally their carbon prices, in particular on domestic firms that are producing with a lot of energy and that are exposed to competition from abroad. The second concern is about potential leakage effects. Leakage means that even if there is a reduction in the CO2 emissions in the country that applies any measures, it may be partially or entirely counterbalanced by increasing emissions abroad, because those countries then could produce more products and using even less clean technologies. So these are two major concerns. An instrument that is discussed in connection with these two concerns is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. This mechanism aims to counterbalance the asymmetries in emission prices across the trading partners. And the idea is to tax imports or the carbon emission content in imports, so that effectively the consumers are taxed rather than producers. So in a way to level the playing field for domestic producers that have to pay a higher price in the existence of taxes or trading systems. And quite topical, the European Union are debating to introduce a carbon border adjustment tax. We don't know many of the details, but a few details we do know, and this is what the paper focuses on. So we incorporate the carbon border adjustment in the GTAP-E model, and we assess the potential effects on the carbon emissions on the global economy. So what we do in particular is we have a pre-simulation where we introduce a carbon price of $44, and in a sensitivity analysis we introduce a carbon price of $88 per ton of emissions in the EU. We then calculate the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment tax, an ad valorem equivalent that would be imposed by the EU plus its 3 ETS partners, which is Norway, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. I mean, it's all EFTA countries, so it includes also Liechtenstein and Iceland. We use this pre-simulation as the new reference. So in order to concentrate on the effects of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, we, after the pre-simulation, we use this as the new reference. The CBAM sectors, we follow the discussion that is taking place in the European Union Parliament, and they have issued a paper where they discuss sectors like paper, oil products, chemical products, cement, steel, aluminium, and so on. So energy-intensive sectors plus electricity. We look into the EU trade flows. So we cover imports, and in one scenario, we also look into the exports of those energy-intensive sectors, because we have one scenario where we introduce an export rebate. We exclude LDCs and SIDs, also as discussed currently in the EU, and we focus on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. That means that we include all direct emissions from fossil fuels, combustion, and industrial processes, plus those emissions that are included in electricity used for the production process. We assume, as in GTAP, in the standard model, that there is one technology per country. So we have the same production process for imports and exports, and that allows us to see what is the emissions embedded in exports. We then look into the bilateral flows of these countries, and since we use an aggregation, we then aggregate into a smaller set of countries and sectors. What you see here is the ad valorem equivalent that has been calculated. So this is based on the CO2 content embedded in the production in these specific countries. And I mean, maybe you don't see the details here. This may be too small, but what it shows is that there is quite a high variation in these AVEs. They are highest on electricity, reflecting how electricity is produced. And it also varies a lot by country, which maybe we can see better on the next slide, where we only show the AVEs for steel and cement. Cement generally has higher AVEs, meaning there is more CO2 emissions embedded in it. Steel is also using, of course, CO2 emissions. They are highest in East Asia, Kazakhstan, India, and Peru. As you can see here, also it varies not only by product, but also significantly by country. The scenarios that we look at are mainly 4 scenarios. So the pre-simulation, which I will not discuss here in the interest of time, which we then use as the new base. And then we introduce in scenario 1 a carbon border adjustment based on the AVEs that I have just shown. In scenario 2, it's the same scenario as scenario 1 plus an export rebate. So if a European company exports, then there is a certain share that is given back to, so in order to offset the higher costs in the EU due to the tax in the EU. So it's an export rebate based on the carbon emission embedded in the export product. This is done again for the same sectors on which we introduced the CBAM. The third scenario, which is called here 04, is the same as the scenario 2, but with a CBAM and export rebate on all products, not only on the energy intensive products. In scenario 05, the fourth scenario, we assume that there is a free allowance, which is currently a common practice in the EU and its ETS partners. So we assume a free allowance of 50% here. This is also given to foreign producers, but converted into metric tons. So if they produce less energy efficient, then in percentage terms, the free allowance is less, has a smaller value for them in relative terms. Scenarios B, which correspond to the first scenarios, we do the same exactly with $88, so twice the price for carbon emissions per ton. The results. So to begin with the most important, perhaps, because the objective is to reduce the CO2 emissions. And we see here that in all scenarios, the global CO2 emissions are reduced further by introducing the CBAM. The effect, though, is fairly small. So in scenario 1 that you see here, it's 26 metric ton, which corresponds to roughly 0.1% of global emissions. So the additional effect on CO2 reductions is relatively small. No surprise here in the scenario, which is called here scenario 05, with the free allowance, the emission reduction is smaller, but not much smaller than in the first scenario. All the scenarios with the price of $88 have higher savings in CO2 emissions, and the results correspond more or less to 75 or 80% of the scenarios under A, where we assume the price of $44. How do the emission reductions distribute among broader regions? We have more disaggregated countries, but then in order to show it nicely, we have aggregated this to broader regional groupings. And we see here that the CO2 emissions increase in Western Europe as well as in North America and the LDC and SIDS. That is because of the relatively clean technologies used in North America. SIDS and LDCs are exempt from any CBAM, so their emissions increase slightly. And Western Europe, that's reducing the leakage effect. So some production comes back to Europe. And since Europe uses generally a more cleaner technology, that reduces the global CO2 emissions. But there is some carbon leakage with the introduction of the tax in Europe, and that we see on this slide nicely. So the first blue bar shows the leakage effect of the pre-simulation. So that this is the increase in carbon emissions in countries outside of Western Europe. And we see here that introducing a CBAM in the following 4 scenarios does reduce the leakage effect. And this effect is between 50 and 80%, depending on the specific scenario. So we could conclude from this simulation that a CBAM does contribute to reducing the leakage effect. On trade, we see that the price index for exports increases, and as a consequence, the quantity traded decreases, and also the value of trade decreases. What we see is that the bilateral exports decrease. So there is, in this graph here, trade with West Europe decreases from all regions except intra-trade in West Europe. So this brown bar, which I hope you can see, goes down in all regions. So regions trade away from Europe because of the CBAM. And there is a higher trade within Europe. So Europe trades more with itself. The welfare effects are mostly negative. So there are negative welfare effects from the introduction of the CBAM as we increase the distortions. So as a decline, the welfare declines. If we look here by region, again, the welfare effects, then we see that all regions lose except East Asia, Western Europe, and North America. And again, the LDC and SIDS, as they are exempt from reduction from the CBAM. The regions mostly affected are rest of Europe, Middle East, North Africa, and to a certain extent Central Asia and South Asia. So these are the regions that are negatively affected by the CBAM. A bit of a puzzle for us is that in the second scenario, the global welfare increases. The second scenario is the CBAM plus an export rebate. So some of the income is when exported, is given back to the exporting countries that introduced the tax in the first place. And the welfare increases slightly. To conclude, the CBAM implementation addresses the 2 main concerns. It addresses the competitiveness. So the exports from West Europe increase. It also addresses the concern of the leakage. which is reduced by 50 to 80%. In terms of adding to the reduction in global CO2 emissions, it has a very small effect. And in terms of trade, it increases the intra-Europe trade and reduces a little bit the trade of West Europe with outside. Yeah, so these are the main conclusions that we have. We have used scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, so perhaps in another work, one could include also scope 3 emissions, which would include then all emissions embedded in the production, in the intermediate goods for the production of the relevant products. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ralph, for your presentation and sticking within the time period, well within the time period. At this point, we are opening the floor for questions. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat box of WebEx. Okay, so the first question is from Florian Freund. Could you elaborate a bit how electricity trade is modeled in GTAP? For example, electricity trade is usually constrained by interconnection capacity.
Okay, shall I directly or?
Yes, please, Ralph.
So, I mean, maybe Erwin and Maxime, if you could step in here. I mean, one thing is that electricity trade is very low. So this is something that doesn't drive the results, even though we have seen that the AVEs on electricity are very high. Maybe Erwin and Maxime, if you could come in on this, that is also
Erwin, would you like
go ahead. No, after you, Maxime.
Okay, sure, thanks. So thanks for the question. We employ a standard Armington assumption for modeling all trade, including electricity. As Ralph mentioned, the volume of trade for electricity is relatively small, and it's occurring almost entirely between bordering countries. So what we found in our simulations is that the impact of trade in electricity is particularly large for some Balkan countries who are exporting electricity to EU. Also like Ukraine and for instance, Russia exports some electricity to EU. On the other hand, one point that should be kept in mind is that in GTAP, in trade in electricity, we also capture tourist expenditures on consuming electricity abroad. And therefore, we can see some trade in electricity, let's say, between EU and China, for instance. So this is one particular point that need to be kept in mind. That's all from my side.
Yes. So we modeled electricity as a single sector. We didn't use GTAP power in this in the simulations. Maybe that's something that we could explore in the next step. There's a question from Martin. Did you retain the standard LeonTF structure for intermediate demand or switch to a non-zero elasticity of substitution on intermediate use of CBAM product? Maxime, you want to take this?
Sure. Yeah, we use the standard GTAP-E elasticity structure. We did not modify it. So, and in this sense, I mean, the fact that we are exploring the CBAM doesn't mean that the substitution possibilities would change in some way. At least, I wouldn't think so. So, in a sense, chemicals won't be substituted by iron and steel, or vice versa. Yeah. I don't know, Erwin, if you would like to add something.
No, I think that's perfect. From Sonja Peterson, what is the story behind East Asia? I hope it was the region. Yes, it is the region. Gaining by CBAM. Are they relatively more energy efficient so they can gain market share compared to other non-EU countries?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is, I think this region is probably quite heterogeneous. So East Asia, you mean maybe this slide, but is there another one that shows? I mean, there are countries that are more efficient producers, like Japan, in East Asia. But also East Asia produces many other goods other than the energy-intensive goods, and generally trade in these goods increases, and so that's adds to the fact that they that there is a positive impact on these countries. So these are the two effects that I found. I don't know, Erwin or Maxime, if there are other factors.
No, it's an aggregate, partly because of Japan and Korea, both of which are gaining from the simulations. Perhaps in the next version, we will have to split East Asia so that we can really show what's going on. In the paper, there's a detailed result, so we can definitely point that out. Okay. From Tom, Ralph, it strikes me that reporting percentage change in welfare would be more informative. Some of the developing regions have relatively low GDP per capita, and reporting welfare in dollars misses the stronger relative impact on these regions.
Yeah, thank you. Good point. We have it. I don't know if I mean, the paper is work in progress. I don't know if we have it already in the paper. But we will definitely put also the value, not only the value, but also in percentage terms, the result.
Okay. Two questions from Julio Gustavo. Thanks for the presentation. Two questions. I'm wondering why you did use an EU CO2 tax and not the existing EU ETS. Do you expect different results? And then the follow-up question is, maybe I missed them, but how high is the leakage rate? And what is your mitigation projection year?
So on the first thing is, I mean, the ETS system, I mean, the base year, of course, since we use GTAP database 10.1, the base year is 2014. And we were thinking, what was the ETS system like in 2014? And I mean, the prices now have increased, but at that time they were relatively low and very unequal in Europe. So yeah, we thought that we make the assumption that if the EU wants to reduce the carbon emissions and want to introduce a CBAM, they should also within the EU have, of course, a more streamlined ETS system. So, and we simulated that by a tax, which then also captures maybe not only the price, the carbon price through the ETS system, but also there are many regulations in the EU that also make production more expensive. So we try to also capture this effect to a certain extent with this tax on the EU. On the leakage, I calculated it. Not sure I find it so quickly. The leakage effect was, I think it was around between 10 and 20%. So there is a significant reduction in the pre-simulation, and then I mean, as we have discussed, there is some leakage, but I'm not sure I find it so quickly. If you can still see my screen, then does this show the leakage here? So we have a reduction in the EU, but this is in percent here. Then no, this is in percent of its own reduction. So this may not really show the leakage effect.
Sorry, Ralph, but we have a slide with leakage, or is it the question about regional distribution of leakage?
Yeah, if I understand, I mean, yes, I can show the slide again, but if I understand correctly, I mean, the question is like what this 13, yeah, this is the leakage, 13%.
Yes, that's the slide.
Yeah.
And then from Cecilia, another question. Could you give some details on how the emissions of the EU vary because of the CBAM? I've probably missed what you have said about this, sorry.
How the EU emissions have changed due to the CBAM?
Yes.
Yes, the emissions increase due to it's this slide. The emissions in the EU increase due to the CBAM, and that is because the leakage is reduced. So there is more production in Western Europe because the production of energy-intensive goods abroad, the price increases, and that's why some of the production kind of comes back or is increased in Western Europe. So that means that the carbon emission in West Europe increase. Global effect is of course negative because the West Europe has a cleaner production of these energy-intensive goods. So in that sense, that's an effect because of the production coming back to West Europe.
Okay, the last and final question. Think of a small economy introducing a carbon tax on a commodity, reduces the incentive to produce a product and an incentive to change the input mix. If you add a CBAM based on domestic technology, the incentive to reduce output is removed. Only the substitution effect remains. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that comment. We will think about that in detail when we finish up on the paper. I think at this point we need to transition to the next presentation. Thank you, Ralph, for your informative presentation, and thank you everyone for all your comments and questions.
Thank you, Erwin, and thanks all for the questions and your interest.
Okay. At this point, we will transition to the next presenter, Anna Straat from University of Waikato, who will be presenting on CBAM and its impact in Asia.
So I think, Ralph, will he need to stop sharing his screen first?
Yeah, I try.
Oh, you can. You'll have to give my presentation, Ralph.
I have I don't know, maybe I have to close and I come back in because I don't manage to close this. Sorry. I will just leave and come back immediately.
We'll miss you.
Oh, I cannot even do that. Tom, can you stop my presentation?
So maybe, Ralph, if you hover your mouse towards the top, you'll see a window going down or a set of options going down.
Maybe I'll try to share my some content from my side. Maybe that'll override Ralph, and then I'll stop. Let you see.
Well, Ralph, you can turn your computer off and turn it back on.
Okay.
Okay. Now I can.
Give it a try now, Hannah.
Okay.
Sorry for that.
No worries.
So was that successful?
Perfect.
Yes.
Great. Oh, well, thank you very much. And great to be here. It's a shame it's not in person, of course. It's very late at night here in New Zealand and early for some of you, I know, in Indiana, and in the middle for many other people. Thanks very much, Ralph, for your presentation. It was great having your presentation first because there's quite a bit of, I guess, overlap in the framework that we're using. So it was great that you did such an excellent job of your presentation. And of course, you'll see some overlap in the authorship here. My colleagues, Erwin and Maxine, great to see you here. They also assisted with the modelling. So it's a very similar modelling framework to that which Ralph used. This is a project that we're also doing some work with UNSCAP. So a couple of my UNSCAP colleagues, Alex Kravchenko and Jan Duval, are also co-authors on this, as well as Victoria, who's one of our Waikato University students, but also UN SCAP intern at the moment. So quite a team effort. This is work that's at a relatively early stage. It's going to be great to get any feedback that you have, and it's great to have Maxine and Erwin here as well, who'll be able to answer or help with detailed modelling questions if there are some. So what we're focusing on is the impacts of carbon policies, not just border tax adjustments. So we're focusing on taxes on carbon emissions, both for selected countries, and we also take a look at imposing a global carbon tax, which some people might argue is the optimal policy. As well as these carbon taxes, we do also look at carbon border adjustments, but they're not quite so central, I guess, in this project as in Ralph's project. The way that these are thought about as follows on nicely from Ralph's explanation: a tax on imported goods where the amount of the tax depends on the emissions associated with those goods. I guess the aim is to reduce the carbon leakage that occurs when you've got strict emission policies in one country, which may lead to increased emissions in another. So we account for the carbon taxes bilaterally, and I think there's a lot of really excellent work that's gone into the embodied emissions trade database. Particularly Maxine has been working on this, which allows us to implement these border adjustments bilaterally to take into account if countries already have a carbon tax in place. We can make that adjustment and reduce the border adjustment by the amount of the tax that's already in place. So we're using the new GTAP-E model, version 10 database, and the 2014 base year. We aggregate it to 55 regions and 24 sectors, so relatively detailed when we do the GTAP modelling, but we further aggregate these regions and sectors to 10 regions and 5 sectors for reporting, and a particular focus on the Asia-Pacific region, given UNSCAP's work in this region. So the carbon taxes, these are modelled as a tax per tonne of carbon emissions associated with the use of fossil fuels. And the border adjustments are modelled by calculating the embodied emissions in bilateral trade flows, and that was the embodied emissions database that I was mentioning before. A tax equal to the differential between the carbon tax is applied, or the differential between the two markets is then applied. So if the region imposing the border adjustment taxes imposes a carbon tax, it will be applied to carbon content from regions not imposing carbon taxes. And where other regions do have a carbon tax, the adjustment is lowered appropriately. So, for example, if the border adjustment tax was $20 and the other region already had a $5 one in place, then it would be a $15 adjustment that would be made. So very similar modelling of the border adjustment mechanism to in Ralph's framework. The simulations that we model in this study, the first simulation that we run is to put in place 2019 carbon taxes. So these are generally sourced from the World Bank's database, and we went with 2019, I guess, to try to avoid COVID impacts that have sent some fluctuations in some carbon taxes, I understand. So we've gone, and also we had relatively good data for those 2019 ones that we could use. So that's the first simulation, is to put in place 2019 carbon taxes for a range of countries. Scenario 2, what this one does is it keeps those carbon taxes in place, but also adds carbon border adjustment taxes for what we call the EU plus region, and I'll define that shortly, but basically the EU region, EFTA and the UK. These are modelled as taxes imposed by the importing region, with adjustments made, as mentioned previously, so that countries only pay the differential tax rate. So scenarios 1 and 2 are very similar. You've got the carbon taxes in scenario 1 and then the border adjustment added in scenario 2. Scenario 3 is where we model a global carbon tax, which arguably provides insights into the optimal case of all countries charging the same tax. There won't be any carbon leakage because every country is putting the same tax in place. Currently, we're modelling 2 versions of this, so we can think of these as scenario 3A with a $10 carbon tax and scenario 3B with a larger $50 global carbon tax. These carbon taxes are applied in all countries. So the aggregate regions, I mentioned that we've got 55 regions or countries that we model, but then we aggregate them together for reporting. This slide shows how we aggregate them with a focus on the Asia-Pacific region. So, for example, that first column is East and Northeast Asia, which comprises China, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, Mongolia, Taiwan, and so forth. The EU plus region I mentioned earlier is also defined there. So that's the EU countries, EU 27, plus the UK, plus the EFTA region. In addition, the other regions are specified, and I'll make mention of some of these countries when we look at some of the results. For example, if you look at North and Central Asia, that includes Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Russia tends to dominate this particular grouping, makes up a very large proportion of the GDP for this region, so it tends to have a big impact on those results. The countries that are in red font are those that we're assuming a carbon tax for. So the ones in black, we're not imposing any carbon tax for that first simulation, but all of the ones in red, we're imposing some sort of a carbon tax in the initial first simulation. These are the particular taxes that we're imposing in scenario 1, and of course those taxes go through into scenario 2 as well. You can see we're imposing a somewhat lower tax than Ralph did in his work on the EU carbon tax. For our EU plus region, we've got that $24.50 tax. It was a lower tax that was in place in 2019, and that's reflected there. The other countries in our list have a range of different taxes. As mentioned, these are largely from the World Bank's database. China and the United States, these are made up of weighted taxes because they only have regional carbon taxes in place. So they're weighted currently by GDP, but we're doing quite a bit of work at the moment where we're hoping to make better assumptions for these countries and for the other countries. So these are the ones that we're modelling at present, but it is an area that we're hoping to do better on, including getting a better handle on the carbon tax coverage for these different countries. So my colleague Alex is doing quite a bit of work on that at present. So given the three scenarios that we've got with the 2019 carbon taxes in place, the first scenario, the second scenario of the 2019 carbon tax plus the border tax adjustments for the EU region, and then the third scenario, A and B, with the $10 and the $50 carbon taxes, let's turn to some preliminary results. Have a look first at some global results, including some decomposition of the key contributions or key contributors. And also we'll have a little look at the regional results with a focus on some of the Asia-Pacific results. So if we look at this first slide here, this is a summary of global results. You can see that we have welfare in millions of US dollars. We've got percentage of GDP, so I guess Tom might also comment on this one. It would be useful to see welfare as a percentage. While we haven't got that here, and I think it is a very useful suggestion, Tom, at least the real GDP is in percentage format, so that gives us some idea, at least when we move on to the regions, that helps. We've got exports, we've got CO2, the change in CO2 emissions in percent, and also in tonnes. If you look along the first bolded line, these are the results for scenario 1. And then if you look at the second, third and fourth row, what these are a decomposition of the scenario 1 results, or they're showing the contribution of particular regions' carbon taxes. So along the top of the line there, we have the impact of all of those 2019 carbon taxes that we implement. And if you look down to the second line, this is those impacts that are due to just the carbon taxes that are implemented by the EU plus region. This third line down here is those that are implemented by China. And fourthly, the US. We could, of course, have done it for all of the other regions that would have given us the totals here, but we've just identified some of them here to give some idea of the key drivers. And not surprisingly, perhaps given that the EU plus region had a relatively high carbon tax, that drives quite a large proportion of the results. Scenario 2 results are in this bolded line along here, with the only decomposition that we're presenting here is that due to the EU plus border adjustment mechanism, because we've already talked about the carbon taxes in scenario 1. Scenario 3A, the $10 border tax, the $10 global carbon tax, and 3B, which is the $50 carbon tax, are shown in the last two rows. We have a look at some of these results. The welfare impact of $35.5 billion in that first scenario, when we impose all of those carbon taxes for different regions, that's actually reasonably similar across into the second scenario and in the third scenario. But just taking a look, if we look at the first scenario first, a very large proportion of that, of course, is driven by the EU plus region itself. In the second scenario, that overall impact is relatively similar, because we can see that the impact of those border tax adjustments is only 109 million. I'll come back to this point that in the third scenario, it's a relatively similar total impact on GDP, because it's interesting when we compare that with the different impacts on emissions of these different scenarios. Not surprisingly, of course, that last scenario, the $50 carbon tax, gives much more significant impacts. When we look at the impact of that first scenario on CO2 emissions, it does reduce the CO2 emissions by about 734 if we're looking at the results in tonnes. If we look at the impacts of the second scenario, it's a further reduction, but it's not a substantial further reduction. And I think this is reasonably similar to the result that Ralph was finding. However, if we look down at the third scenario, where we have a global carbon tax, although it has almost the same impact on global welfare as the first scenario, in fact, slightly less, it has a much more significant impact on carbon emissions, around about 3 times the amount of carbon emissions as we got in that first scenario. So this idea that this is a much more efficient way of operating policy certainly seems to be reflected in these results. I'd also make the comment that in terms of welfare, the EU drives a lot of those results. So more than 80% of those welfare results are driven by the EU carbon taxes that we model. However, they only drive around about a 35% change in the carbon emissions. Whereas for China, it's having a smaller impact on global welfare, but a much larger relative proportion on global emissions. So for China, the impact on global welfare is about 21% of the contribution, but the impact on global emissions, the impact on global emissions is about 21%, but it's only about 2% of the welfare impact. And perhaps this is not surprising with China being a relatively intensive use of carbon. So let's move along to a wee bit of trouble with my slides, but let's keep going. Let's have a look at the simulated change in CO2 emissions by region. And if we look at these CO2 emissions by region, again, we've got scenario 1 here with the bolded column showing the total impacts, and then some decomposition similar to the previous slide due to EU, China and US carbon taxes. We've got scenario 2 and scenario 3, but now we're looking at these impacts on CO2 emissions in terms of those different regions that I showed you the definitions of previously. Not surprisingly, the EU Plus has a big reduction in those carbon emissions because of that relatively big carbon tax in place in the EU. Most of that, of course, is coming from the carbon tax that the EU itself imposes. When we look at the impact of the EU alone imposing that carbon tax, every other country's emissions go up a little. So you might argue that this is some form of leakage due to that EU carbon tax. Although overall, by the time we take into account all of the other countries' taxes that we impose, we can see in that first column that they don't all end up with higher emissions. So I think this decomposition into what's due to the EU carbon taxes gives us some extra insights here. In the second scenario, we've still got quite a big impact on EU emissions. It doesn't change greatly because that border tax adjustment only makes a fairly small change in the results. These regions here that reduce emissions with the border tax adjustment mechanism in place, these tend to be the regions that weren't highlighted in red font or don't have many countries with significant carbon taxes from that previous slide. So it's not, these countries are reducing their emissions a bit with that border tax adjustment, but not necessarily overall, because as you can see overall, although the EU border tax adjustment is driving some reduction, overall, in some cases, you still get some small expansion. When we turn to those global carbon tax results, we get much more even impacts over all of the countries and, of course, much larger impacts in terms of reductions of emissions for that $50 carbon tax, but much more even reductions in emissions across countries, which is perhaps not surprising. Looking at the change in real GDP in percent, if we look at those first 2 scenarios, which are the red and yellow lines, the EU region itself is the one that's particularly harmed because they've got those relatively high carbon taxes in place. But we also see some relatively big impacts, for example, for this North and Central Asian region. And that's not because of the carbon taxes that they're imposing themselves. That's mainly because of those trade flows with Europe. And there are some figures, if I have time shortly, to show you those. There's also impacts on real household consumption. And these tend to mirror those impacts in real GDP, although not completely, of course. If I just turn to look briefly at these export results, because I guess I'm running short of time.
Anna, 2-minute warning, Anna.
Perfect, thanks. Just look briefly at some export results then, thanks. This figure here, it's a wee bit of a complicated one, but the way it's working is this radar. Around the outside of that radar is the importing region, and these lines here are showing the exporting regions. So it's giving us a good feel for what's happening to bilateral exports. And what we can see, for example, I mentioned that North Central Asian region before. If we look at those bilateral exports to the EU plus region, you can see that that's right down in the negative territory. So there was a big reduction in those bilateral exports there. Whereas the general equilibrium effects, I guess, are that that region actually expanded exports to a number of other regions in this aggregation. The other region that's perhaps of interest to keep your eye on here is this green EU plus region, the dark green one that you can see here. When we flip over to the next slide, which is scenario 2, you'll see that pop out a bit, which is the same result that Ralph found, that you get more intra-EU trade. You can see it popped out just there. You get more of this intra-EU trade when you've got the border, the carbon border adjustment mechanism in place. And as it turns out, it actually further impacted that central North Asia region. So those are the just a flavour of those bilateral results. If we turn to scenario 3, this is just scenario 3A, we see that we have much more broad, the impacts are much more similar across those different regions in terms of impacts on bilateral exports. So just to summarise then, the 2019 carbon taxes that we see in place, the 2019 carbon taxes modelled emissions, reducing emissions in regions with taxes and raising emissions in regions without taxes. When we added those carbon border adjustments, they tended to reduce emissions in regions without carbon taxes, but had a fairly small impact on global emissions. The global carbon taxes, they had a much bigger impact on emissions at a much smaller economic cost. This is very much work in progress. Looking forward to any feedback, any suggestions, comments, questions that you have. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Anna, for a very clear presentation. We have a few questions from in the chat box. The first is from Sonia Peterson. Thanks for the presentation. I have a question about modeling existing, in your case, 2019 carbon taxes. Is it not the case that GTAP implicitly includes already in the base year, that is carbon taxes for 2014, so that one should implement the difference between 2019 and 2014? How did you do it?
This is a great question, and it's one that, Erwin, you'll remember we had lots of conversations about this. While you might argue that those carbon taxes are reflected in the data flows in that 2014 database to the extent that they were in place, although they were lower, as Ralph mentioned, in 2014, quite significantly lower in many cases, they're not going to be fully reflected. And they're not going to be fully reflected in there, and I guess we thought about, well, do we put some taxes in place for 2014, or do we just go straight to the 2019 ones? We could have put a 2014 set of taxes in place, for example, using something like an outer tax to put those taxes that should have been in place in a database, because of course we don't have the emission taxes in the GTAP database, but the impacts of it may be reflected in some of those trade flows. So we thought about doing that, but then what we really wanted to see was the things like the leakage that this causes when you put these taxes in place and the impacts of these taxes. So we decided on balance just to model them, put those 2019 taxes in place on the 2019 taxes in place on the 2014 database. Something that we did think about and we may go back to is doing the projection through to 2019. So we've got a 2019 database that's much more representative of how the global economy looks in 2019. So yeah, great question. Something we struggled with a lot. Erwin, I don't know if you want to add to that, because I know it was something we had many conversations about.
Yeah, no, I just want to make a comment on there's this comment to the GTAP team. Would it not be great to have sectoral carbon prices explicitly in the future in the database? Point well taken, but yeah, it will be something that's quite difficult to do. But I know Maxime has put together a side data, a satellite data for his own purposes on carbon taxes for each region or country. He used this for modeling the INDCs. I think there's a next question from Julio. Thanks for the presentation, Anna. A strong feature of your paper is that it accounts for carbon pricing, also in non-EU plus countries. This is very realistic and required by WTO law. A nice extension of your work would be to see what happens if non-EU plus countries without carbon pricing adopt a carbon pricing regime. Several papers in the literature show how non-coalition countries might be better off by adopting carbon pricing rather than being subject to BCA. Yes, thank you for that comment. Maxime responded on the database and how carbon taxes are being implemented. From Florian, thanks, Anna. Did anyone try to combine allocative efficiency and CO2 emissions into an aggregate global welfare measure in a CGE context?
That's a great question, isn't it? Because I guess we're used to looking at these standard economic effects, which in this case, of course, are an economic cost, but we shouldn't view it just as a cost because we're getting a significant benefit from those CO2 emissions. So I guess it's implicit in these discussions is that we want these CO2 emissions, and that is bringing significant benefits. There is a bit of an opportunity cost in terms of some reduction in the traditionally valued measures of economic welfare or GDP, but of course those are benefits in terms of emission. I like that suggestion. I'm not quite sure how to do it, but I think it's something that we should keep very much front of mind, that when we're seeing these economic costs, we've got to make sure that we're also keeping at the forefront of our mind the benefits of these emission reductions.
Yes, and then there's a follow-up question. Well, there's a question from Martin. When presenting welfare impacts of a carbon tax, let's say $50, why not present the global welfare as EV plus forgone emissions at $50 per ton? Changes the sign in your application. It's very similar to the previous question. Here's a question from Luca. What is the impact of BCA on the tariff structure? There is evidence that present tariffs provide an implicit carbon subsidy.
I don't know. It wasn't something I looked at in the results. I don't know if Erwin looked at that. I was interested, in Ralph's presentation, I was interested to see that he presented those tariff equivalents, and I think that's something that we should certainly be looking at. So I don't have any immediate response on that, sorry. But Erwin, anything that you recall?
Not specifically, but if Ralph's presentation had those
Yes.
in across sectors, but we can definitely put it in the PowerPoint when
and that would allow us to respond better to this question of how it looks compared to existing tariffs in place and so forth. Yeah, thanks for that, and sorry I haven't got a better response at present.
Thank you. And one last question from Anna. Thanks for the presentation. It would be interesting to see what level of carbon tax would be to achieve global net zero with and without BCA. Yeah,
certainly would. We can add that to the list.
Yeah. All right. I think we'll end our discussion and on Anna's presentation here.
Can I say one thing?
Oh, sure, Dominique.
Yeah, on the issue about the initial database, in 2014, ETS prices were very low, so I'm not sure it's going to have a huge impact on the results. If we actually had it in the database, I do for certain simulations, I do a version of alter tax where I introduce the carbon price, and as I say, it doesn't make a huge difference to the actual database because it's just so low. But there is a way to do it with alter tax. But
yeah, it's certainly a valid question.
As we move forward to future years, obviously, where the ETS really starts biting, then I think we will have to address that issue more explicitly.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dominique.
Thank you, Dominique. All right, so at this point, we will transition to the next presentation by Francesco. He will be presenting alternative border carbon adjustment mechanisms in the EU and responses.
Okay, you should be able to see my screen, right?
Yes, yes.
Let
you
me
could make it in
yeah, I'm going to presenter mode. And you can just a second, then I'll switch to display settings.
Yep. Display settings.
Okay, now you should be able to see the screen.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So thank you everyone for being here today. And I'm presenting this work also on border carbon adjustment mechanisms and potential responses by trade partners. And this work is, I'm a PhD student from the University of Copenhagen. And this work is in collaboration with my supervisor, Busheng Yu, and with Erwin from Purdue University. Well, the outline is the usual, so I'll introduce the concept, and then I will present the modeling framework and the baseline simulation, then how we design the scenarios, and then I will present some preliminary results and conclusions. So first of all, we know that with the EU Green Deal, the EU is aiming at reducing emissions by 55% by 2030 relative to the 1990 levels. And we know that unilateral carbon policy, as also explained in the previous presentations, we know that unilateral carbon policy can lead to carbon leakages, especially in industries which are energy intensive and trade exposed, such as cement, chemicals, steel, aluminum, and some others. To counteract carbon leakage risks, the EU is at the moment evaluating whether to implement a border carbon adjustment, and we will know a bit more we should be knowing a bit more at the beginning of July. And many studies based on CG models have shown the potential for border carbon adjustment in reducing carbon leakages. Two of the studies were presented once again just before. But as of today, we know that no border carbon adjustment is implemented on a very large scale. In fact, we know that border carbon adjustments are complex tools and will face an array of challenges. And one of these challenges is potentially that a new border carbon adjustment might be met with retaliatory measures by trade partners. So what do we do in this paper? We look within the context of the EU Green Deal, so reduction due to the EU Green Deal. We study the implications of 2 border carbon adjustment on ATA imports and 3 international responses, so three responses by trade partners. And we look at the implications on greenhouse gas emissions and on output of ATA industries. We contribute to the literature by presenting new results, not only for the EU as a whole, but also for some EU members and groups of members. And we also show some new results on potential retaliatory and cooperative behaviors by the trade partners. But we also contribute, this study also contributes to the literature on the methodological side as we modify and use a novel recursive dynamic CG model. So, as I said, in this study, we used the GTAP-E model, which is originally developed by Erwin. And to this model, we have also added some features for the scope of this study. So first of all, we have added a twist specification, so a cost-neutral twist preference specification to allow us to target exogenous changes to the electricity generated by renewable sources in every country. We have also implemented 3 greenhouse gas emission trading systems. So the first greenhouse gas emission trading system implements carbon prices at the economy-wide level in each region, and this extends the standard GTAP-E carbon pricing system, which the GTAP-E standard covers GTAP-E covers CO2 emissions, whereas this trading system covers both CO2 and non-CO2 emissions. We also added two additional emission pricing systems. So the first one covers covers the EU ETS sectors. So this means that we have a EU-wide price and target for power and industrial sectors following the EU ETS regulation. The other one covers broadly the EU effort sharing regulation sector, so the remaining part of the economy. In this system, each EU region faces a different carbon price to target reductions, which are established by the EU ESR, and countries do not trade emission permits with other countries, pretty much. Finally, within the model, we also coded some alternative border carbon adjustments, so we can implement carbon prices directly on greenhouse gas emissions embedded in imports. And here we have different border carbon adjustment with different geographical and emission scopes. We calibrate the model on the GTAP power and the GTAP non-CO2 databases version 10. And we have 16 regions, 16 commodities, and 17 sectors. So the discrepancy between by the number of sectors and the number of commodities is due to the fact that the electricity commodity is produced using both renewable and non-renewable sources. So you have 2 different sectors producing electricity. So in this study, we project the GTAP version 10 databases from 2014, which is the base year, until 2030. And we do that in 1-year steps. As it is fairly standard, we impose exogenous changes to update the databases. So first of all, we have GDP, which follows historical data until 2019, then post-COVID projections between 2020 and 2025 by the IMF, and then SSP2 projections until 2030. We also exogenously target changes in population labor force following SSP2 projections. We target differential sectoral productivities and autonomous energy efficiency improvements in all regions. We model, we assume that iceberg trade costs are to decrease globally, with the exception of an increase in 2021 due to Brexit between the EU and the UK. And already in the baseline, we also target changes in CO2 and non-CO2 emissions. So CO2 emissions follow historical data until 2020, including changes in 2020 due to COVID. In 2021, we assume a rebound, and then we assume decreases in line with the individual countries' INDCs. So in the EU, we target reductions both as currently established in the EU ETS and the EU ESR policies, whereas in the rest of the world, we target economy-wide reductions, and we use external projections from which are in line with INDC's targets. We do something similar for non-CO2 emissions, targeting historical data until 2019. Then we keep the emissions endogenous for 2020 and 2021, mostly due to lack of data for these 2 years. And then we assume that from 2022 onwards, they follow INDC developments as other studies have pointed out. Finally, we also target the electricity, the quantity of electricity produced by renewables. So, we target it in the baseline, and we follow historical data and data in line with countries' INDCs and a national energy and climate plan for EU countries. So once we have this baseline, against this baseline, we define the scenarios. And we design simulate 6 scenarios. So all scenarios assume the same reduction in EU greenhouse gases in 2030 compared to the baseline. And these are achieved by increased ambition in both the EU ETS and the EU ESR policies that we implement already in the baseline. But then the scenarios differ in other 4 dimensions. So the EU Green Deal scenarios fixes carbon prices in non-EU regions at the baseline level and keeps the emissions in non-EU regions endogenous. And in this scenario, no border carbon adjustments are implemented. Then we have a second scenario. And in this scenario, we assume the implementation of a border carbon adjustment by the European Union. And this border carbon adjustment covers EU ETS imports, so chemical, cement, steel, and aluminium in this specific case. And this is based on EU direct sectoral emission intensity. So it uses the EU direct sectoral emission intensity as a benchmark. The price we set for the border carbon adjustment is the yearly EU ETS price from the first scenario, which is the carbon price faced by the ETS sectors. And this roughly mimics the notional ETS concept, which is being discussed, which is one of the potential candidates for the EU border carbon adjustment. And with this first design of the border carbon adjustment, the additional import tariff faced by all non-EU countries is the same, and this potentially improves the chances of WTO compatibility of this measure. Then we also model a more aggressive border carbon adjustment, which now discriminates across countries using both sectoral direct and indirect emissions. By indirect emission intensities, we mean the emissions tied to the generation of electricity used by the sector. And these emission intensities in the rest of the world are now currently higher than the EU average emission intensities at the moment. Then we have 2 scenarios in which the rest of the world retaliates against the EU, and both of them are based on the implementation of an aggressive border carbon adjustment by the EU, as presented in the previous scenario. The 2 scenarios base the border carbon adjustment on the EU imports, using the same price as EU based on EU average sectoral emission intensities, one, and the other one basis on individual EU members' sectoral emission intensities. And this might give, as I will show, this might give some slightly different results. And then finally, we run a scenario in which the EU Green Deal scenario, so the first scenario, is met with increased economy-wide carbon prices in non-EU regions, so to keep emission fixed to the baseline level. But now let's go to the results, or our preliminary results. And first of all, let's look at the effect on global greenhouse gas emissions compared to the baseline. So in our simulation, the EU Green Deal scenario reduces emissions by approximately 0.9% compared to the baseline. And the economy-wide carbon leakage is quite high, at 45%. The implementation of various BCAs reduces further the emissions at the global level, but does not so significantly. So, for example, with the EU GD BCA2, so the aggressive border carbon adjustment, we have the carbon leakage being reduced to approximately 40%. And the implementation also of retaliatory measure does not affect significantly global emission reductions. However, the increasing in carbon prices in non-EU countries, so to keep the aggregate carbon linkage equal to 0, because we have the emissions in the rest of the world are fixed now to the baseline, this leads to global reductions compared to the baseline by 1.6%. And we can see that in our simulation results, we observe that these results reflect not only the risk of carbon leakage due to indirect climate policy, but also partially reflect the fact that the decreasing EU share of global emissions. So now let's move on to the results, to showing the results for IT sectors in the EU. And we'll see results about imports, exports, output, and IT emissions. So compared to the baseline, greenhouse gas emissions in IT sectors are decreased by 16% in the EU Green Deal scenario. The EU climate efforts lead to a reduction in output by 3.5%, and due to competitiveness losses both in international and domestic market, we observe an increase in IT imports in the EU from the rest of the world, and a reduction in exports to the rest of the world. And the carbon leakage for the four sectors we are looking at, so for the 4 IT sectors, the aggregate carbon leakage is 85%. The implementation of a WTO compatible, so the first border carbon adjustment, affects IT imports directly, which now are reduced by 4% compared to the baseline. While the border carbon adjustment protects IT producers on domestic market, non-EU countries' IT production is now diverted to non-EU countries. And in fact, our simulation results show that there is an increase in trade within the EU, so intra-EU trade, but there is also an increase in trade among non-EU regions compared to the EU Green Deal scenario. All in all, we observe that IT output is reduced less than the EU Green Deal scenario, and IT emissions are now slightly higher. The leakage rate is slightly reduced at 75%. A more aggressive border carbon adjustment based on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emission intensities and now discriminating across international trade partners. This reduces emissions by 16% compared to the baseline, and this also means stronger diversion effects on non-EU products to other non-EU countries. The aggressive border carbon adjustment in our simulation keeps the IT output virtually unchanged compared to the baseline, and emissions are reduced now by 14% in the EU, with increased emission reduction in electricity generation to achieve the overall EU goal, which is fixed by assumption. The IT sector's leakage rate now is reduced to 10%. The introduction of a retaliatory tariff, a retaliatory border carbon adjustments by non-EU regions on the EU, obviously, first thing that it affects is the EU exports to the rest of the world, in IT products, of course. These are now reduced by 15% compared to the baseline. And due to trade diversion, also EU imports from non-EU regions are further reduced. The output of EU IT sectors is now reduced more than the EU, than in the case when we have only the aggressive border carbon adjustment, but is still less reduced than in the scenario with WTO compatible border carbon adjustment. IT emissions are reduced by 15%, and the leakage rate is now a bit higher at 40%. The implementation of retaliatory border carbon adjustment that now differentiates across EU members on the EU aggregate doesn't make a major difference compared to the scenario just presented. And finally, in a more cooperative scenario with zero aggregate carbon leakage, so economy-wide carbon leakage is zero, we still observe similar results in IT sectors compared to the Green Deal scenario. And this is due to the fact that most of the reductions compared to the Green Deal scenario in the rest of the world, they are carried out in the electricity generation sector. Moving on to the IT output results for specific countries. We observed that in the EU Green Deal scenario, our simulations show an aggregate reduction in IT output by 3.5%, as I presented in the previous slide. However, the Visegrad countries and Benelux and Germany reduce the IT output more than the EU average, whereas France is the only EU member that increases its IT output. And these differences that we observe across countries are driven by the differences in direct emission intensities, but also by the differences in the changing price of intermediate goods to the EU-wide policy regimes, such as electricity. So, for example, thanks to the high share of nuclear in its electricity mix, France's electricity price is not strongly affected by the EU-wide EUTS carbon price, whereas Visegrad countries such as Poland have still a high share of coal in their energy mix, and this also affects the energy intensive sectors. We also observe that the implementation of EU border carbon adjustments increases EU outputs in all EU members, but we can still observe that several members are consistently affected more than others. And we also see with our results that the two different retaliatory border carbon adjustments have pretty much the overall aggregate effect on EU ETA output, but countries are affected slightly differently. And this is due to differences in emission intensities linked to the ETA production and to electricity production. So, for example, here we can see that the Visegrad group is affected differently, and it's affected most. So the output of ETA sector is reduced most when the rest of the world targets individual regions emission intensities. Finally, we also observe that in the more cooperative scenario, the changes in ETA output are pretty much the same as under the EU Green Deal scenario. So here and here. Concluding, we observe, so from our simulation results, we observe that the EU Green Deal may generate carbon leakages, that a WTO-compliant border carbon adjustment is unlikely to reduce carbon leakage significantly, whereas a more aggressive border carbon adjustment might reduce ETA sector's carbon leakage and address EU competitiveness concerns. We also observe that retaliatory actions to the aggressive, in reaction to the aggressive EU border carbon adjustment may partially offset the EU gains due to the BCA, but ETA output losses are still smaller than under the EU Green Deal scenario and the EU Green Deal with a weaker border carbon adjustment. And finally, we observe that with the BCAs considered in the studies, these border carbon adjustments are not expected to change the unequal distribution of ETA outputs across the EU members, and several members are consistently affected more than others across all scenarios. Finally, very briefly, what is potential future research done for the study? So we could introduce a CO2 process emission in the GTAP-E modeling framework. We could design a new border carbon adjustment made based on more recent announcements. We could model more in detail new climate policies, so for example, with updated INDCs. And finally, we could characterize supply-side structural changes within the CGE model. So, for example, changing sectoral cost shares due to the implementation of new technologies. Thank you for listening, and that's about it. I'll stop sharing now, and if you have questions, I'll share again. If that's okay for you, Robin.
Yes. Thank you so much, Francesco, for your presentation and for providing a different perspective on the medium-term perspective of implementing border carbon adjustments by the EU. There's one question from Maxime. Thank you for the presentation, Francesco. I'm surprised with the huge rate of EU carbon leakage, 85% for ETA, if I understood correctly. This seemed to be much more than most studies report. A recent IMF study suggests that half of the leakage is taking place in non-ETS sectors. Some other simulations show that when taking into account the current free allocation setup, most carbon leakage may actually take place in the non-ETS sector, as the ETS sectors receive high share of free allocation and relatively higher mitigation burden would be put on sectors outside the EU. Can you comment a bit on this result?
Thanks, Maxime, for this comment. So the way we model the EU ETS policy in our modeling framework is not exactly mimicking one-to-one the change in the EU actual policy. So, for example, we don't have the free allocation that is in place in already in place with the current regulation to protect IT industries from carbon leakages. And this is actually also something that I mean, we still don't know much about it, but it's also something that's being discussed about whether to implement the CBAM, so the EU CBAM, whether to implement it only on imports, or also keep the basically the free allocation and the export subsidies to, or some implicit export subsidies to some specific industries. So yeah, here the result, the carbon leakage is actually quite high for the IT industries, and I mean here it's also due to partially due to the fact that we don't only look at the competitiveness channel, but we also have changes in energy prices, and this has some ripple effect on the actual carbon leakage rate. But yeah, this is also something to keep into account. I was reading that non-ETS sectors might also be exposed to carbon leakages, and this will be a very interesting area to research upon. But for example, for example, in agriculture, at the moment, the EU does not have a explicit carbon pricing policies. So it would be also difficult to implement border carbon adjustments that could be accepted at the WTO level. But it's something to look upon and to research further. I don't know if that answers the question.
If I may, yeah, thanks for clarification. So essentially, it could be non-carbon pricing measures that would be implemented outside the ETS sectors that would lead to reductions in emissions to meet the EU Green Deal, and this could lead to leakage. So not necessarily the ETS price itself, and it could be in transportation, it could be in even some service sectors and so on. But thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think I missed this. There's a question from Julio. Yes. Great presentation, Francesco. Similar to my previous comment, why don't you let countries not only retaliate but also cooperate, for instance, by adopting carbon pricing or increasing ambition?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you, Julio. So we have one scenario in which there is not full cooperation, of course, but there is a slight increase in carbon prices. So to keep the carbon leak, at least the aggregate carbon leakage to be zero. But we also, I also ran another scenario, which I'm not presenting in this paper, but it was while I was thinking of doing that, and then I didn't present it. Where we actually increased the carbon prices or the climate commitments in all other countries, and we will keep this in mind potentially to add this to the paper in the future. So we could also have a more balanced representations into retaliatory situation and to more cooperative situation.
Okay. Any more questions from the floor? Okay. Well, perhaps I just have one question, although I'm not supposed to ask it. If there's something you can share in the modeling, for example, or in creating the scenarios, is there something that you find the most challenging, creating all the scenarios and making sure that they make sense in terms of the results? Is there anything that you find the most or what is the most challenging part of the exercise that you found?
I don't know whether that's an answer or that's the answer you would expect, but the most challenging part, to me at least in this specific case, was to actually get the baseline data together coherently. Also because you have different INDC commitments, but you also have different trajectories when it comes to For example, changes in electricity consumption, changes in electricity production at the country level. And I mean, COVID also didn't help in that regard. So this what actually took the longest. And I mean, with regard to the scenario design, what is the most challenging thing? I mean, not from a modeling perspective, but mostly from uncertainty perspective, because we don't know exactly much. We don't know much about how the EU border carbon adjustment might look. We have some. I mean, there are some discussions. There are some leaks from. There was a leak probably a couple of weeks ago. So we don't know that much. So we are still in a place where we have to make many assumptions on which sectors are going to be covered. Will it be a national ETS? Will least developed countries be exempted or not? Are we going to use some kind of benchmark, or is it going to be discriminating across all countries? And here, I mean, we could potentially, I could potentially think of different, like 10, 15 different types of border carbon adjustment that could be implemented. So it was quite tough to actually think of what is the border carbon adjustment. And here it's, from what I've heard and what I've read, what is the most likely to happen at the moment. And figure out, that one was the hardest part in terms of scenario design, at least. And I mean, on the modeling side, also I cannot think of one thing that was more difficult or more challenging than others. But yeah.
But we do hope that it's all worth it, right?
Well, yes.
Okay. I don't see any more question, and we are almost out of time as well. Unless there is a burning question from anyone, I would suggest that we now end the session. And I would like to thank all the presenters for sticking to the time and giving very clear presentations. And I would also like to thank everyone who participated in this very productive session. I found it very productive. Thank you so much for your participation in this session. And there are 2 more sessions or 3 more sessions to go. We hope to see you in the other session.